All right, in a second, we'll start up our chat. It's kind of weird not having an episode yesterday.
Yeah, it was. I know. Like we're actually starting our week on a Monday.
Right? You had a good weekend?
Yeah, it was nice, fun. Saturday was a long day, but like I really didn't drink that much, so it was nice because it's like, oh, I don't have to. It's like a whole. It's funny. We can talk about it on this call, but
For
yeah,
sure.
it was fun
That's
talking about
awesome. I'm
it.
just
It was,
enabling everything here. You go right ahead and tell me about your weekend.
all right. Yeah, so it was fun. So I went out Saturday. There's this thing called Gasparilla in Tampa. It's like there's some history and it's kind of just become like a day of partying. And guys dress up as pirates. There's some historical thing with the whole pirate thing, and there's a big, pirate type presence in Tampa Bay area. Football teams called the Buccaneers and whatever. So Gasparilla is like, I don't know, just a party day at this point. And so I was out pretty much all day, and it's like a morning people start type thing. So I had a few drinks in the morning, and then just kind of I was out all day, but I was very much like having a drink every here and there and drinking water. And it was like I never got to a point where I felt like even that drunk. It was more just like, I don't know. I was just enjoying being out. We went to a couple party pregame things throughout. The weather's nice down here. It's like it was, quote unquote colder on Saturday, but it was like 60 degrees, all 60 Fahrenheit. So, whatever that is, what is that? 20 Celsius, maybe ish, 15, 20. Nice enough. So
Nice.
yeah. And then yeah. And I mean now it's like 75, which is probably closer to 20, 25 Celsius. Trying to do that quick in my head. But yeah, it was a fun day. And then eventually we were out later, and I posted that vlog yesterday from it. I've been liking getting some of those out there here and there, and I was able to sort of cross promote our alcohol episode in it, which I figured that could work. That could actually be something if I do more vlogs, just like focusing the topic that I talk about on a recent episode or something. Just another way to cross promote. But yeah, I was talking to these two girls I had met at the bar, and they both had crosses on. I love having those chats with people because they both had crosses on, and so they were Catholic. But most kids that age in their 20s who are Catholic are nominally Catholic, and usually it's just out of fear and like the foisting of responsibility and whatnot. And so I of course just like, so have you guys recognized that you're God though? And they were just like, what are you talking about? What do you mean God? Like, no, I don't. And I was like, so what do you think God is? Like, well, I don't know, like the creator of everything. I don't know. And it's like, do you think he's like an old man up in the sky? And usually to that one, people are like, well, no, like it's some obvious thing. It's like, well, then what is your idea of him? Do you think it's a him? And so I was just asking a bunch of questions like that, just kind of going off, and eventually just kind of they just stopped sort of responding, but we were still talking. So I was like, all right, they've had enough. I'll keep talking about some other stuff. But it was pretty funny because no one ever talks about that stuff, so they don't even know how to possibly react to that type of situation. But it was fun, and yeah, eventually, things just, the night ended and whatnot. But yeah, it was fun. Well, as I do enjoy bringing that up to people here and there, especially when you start getting into some depth of a conversation, not necessarily that depth, but then you just keep going with it. And because I don't really give a shit of like how the outcome's going to be. Like I used to, when I was younger, like in college especially, I'd be super concerned. Like I wouldn't bring something like that up because I would be afraid the girl would run away or something. And now that I don't really care so much about that, there's no barrier to me bringing up any topic. And so eventually I'm sure there's going to be someone or whoever that I bring that up to, and they don't they're like more intrigued than afraid, and then I'll be like, all right, let's keep chatting. That has happened a couple times in the past, and it's always leads to at least a decent relationship for a bit. But yeah,
Well, in my opinion, you're saving yourself some time and a bit of a headache by just getting through the uncomfortable stuff. Like, why beat around the bush when you can just, in a couple of sentences, say very clearly, this is how I think about things, or I do think about things, and this is how the conversation is going to go. And you're giving them some indication, at least, of whether or not they want to get involved. You're being honest about it, right? And I think that's really important. But you're right, you have to get past that need to be liked. You have to get past that need to, get anything out of any conversation outside of the conversation in itself. But once you're there, you're free. But as somebody who's gone through all that phase, like I said, I used to introduce myself as God. So that was always a fun conversation starter. I just wanted to say to our listener and our viewers that there are other ways to get into the conversation. There are numerous ways. It's always important to go in and rock a few boats, because again, you're saving yourself time. But when that one person does stick around and they have questions, nuance, sensitivity, empathy, all that fun stuff, which we will be talking about this coming weekend on February 4th and 5th in detail. We'll be doing a 4-hour workshop, 7 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday, on relationships and dating. And we're going to go through all of these things, considerations, things to watch out for, things that you want to do, regardless of your mind telling you don't do that. There's a lot to discuss. So if you'd like to join us, tickets are available at dualistiCunity.com. Feel free to purchase those. If you are a Patreon supporter, you get a discount. Don't forget to look up your discount. Of course, I think it's 30 to 50%, depending on your tier. And it's going to be a fun conversation. Admittedly, it's one of my favorite topics in general, because I talk to so many clients about relationships as a whole, whether it be relationships with somebody that they're currently dating, or the process of being out in the field, dating as a whole, being single, or if you just got out of a long-term relationship and you're trying to get back into the mix. These are all things that are worthy of conversation, but unfortunately we can't just cover it here in one episode, and it would be less fruitful to do so because you're not here to talk to us about what you're going through, which is why I like the workshops. There will be 1 hour of conversation with Andrew and I, and then 1 hour of Q&A each day. Perfect opportunity for you to ask questions, share your story, hear other people's point of view, because they're going to be there with you as well. It's a lot of fun. Workshops are absolutely great. We do have a couple other things to talk about. I'll just pass this back to Andrew first before I get to more announcements, and see if he has anything else he'd like to mention.
Yeah, just excited for that workshop. I think it'll be fun because Ray and I are coming at it from sort of two different angles, as we always do with things. I mean, everyone has their own unique experience, and we certainly have pretty vastly differing backgrounds with everything, but also just the point in life that we're at and the experiences that we're currently having. Ray more so being in a longer term relationship for the last 19 or so years, and myself not being in any sort of relationship right now. Just my experiences of being kind of in that age where people start to think about marriage and kids and have all these made up societal ideas and bars where it's like, oh, by 30 you should be married and have kids, and by 40 be set in your job and working your way up, and all this just made up bullshit that doesn't actually exist. And so it'll be fun to discuss relationships and the process of dating next weekend. And yeah, because especially coming at it from the perspective that we come at everything from, to a degree, of recognizing yourself and everyone. And so if you're recognizing that and having some difficulty with, I don't know, moving through sort of relationships in that, and talking, wanting to talk about these types of things with people, it's not always the most welcomed conversation. And so there has to be a willingness to prioritize yourself and the conversations that you want to have. And with that comes a willingness to let go of the need for someone to come with you on that path. And it always has to come down to you and being complete in yourself and having your experience for you. And with that, people don't always stick around so much. And so there has to be a balance, but not so much a balance that you're sacrificing your own experience. So anyway, that's a lot of the stuff that we're gonna talk about next weekend. If you have questions on this live stream, like, we're happy to touch on some things for sure, but I know we have some other stuff that we want to get into, so I'll pass back to Ray.
We do have some other stuff that we want to get into, but one more thing, just because it's coming up pretty shortly, Tuesday night, 6 p.m. this week, we're going to be doing a roundtable episode. But our roundtable episodes have been reformatted in that we're going to be doing them like we did for Dualistic Unity Raw episode 20, where basically it's members of our community. So tier 2 and tier 3 supporters have the option to join us for a group episode tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Eastern time. You can find the link and the registration form on Patreon. You can also look at the contact section on our website. There's a link to it there. And you get to join us for an hour and 45 minutes as we go around and talk about different topics. Of course, there will be an audience participating, as there is right now in the comments section, which means that we'll be going around answering questions. If you can't join us on screen, then you're more than welcome to join us in the comments section and help inform and inspire the conversation as it goes on. But we're going to do this every second Tuesday. So there's going to be a roundtable now every second Tuesday, which I'm very excited about because I love roundtable episodes. And then every alternate Tuesday, we're going to be doing a call-in show like we did last Tuesday, which was a lot of fun in my opinion.
Oh yeah, those are a blast. I'm really excited about the new format for Tuesday. Twitches, because both get more and more people involved. The one with a little bit more formal and people who are already involved in the conversation. The other with the call-in show being potentially brand new people who may have questions. And that's a part that I really enjoy, because I went back and I've been going through clipping up some stuff from some of our early episodes, and it's really interesting and kind of funny for me to watch myself back in especially early season 1, but pretty much all of season 1 and into season 2. And it's like there's not really a line where it shifts. It's just like this progression of becoming more and more comfortable, less and less hesitant, just more and more free in myself, is very interesting to see, because even my tone of voice, and when I go back to videos that I filmed back then, my tone of voice is like way different. It was way more rigid and serious and sort of hesitant. And this was after, mind you, after I had, woken up or, whatever. And it just goes to show how much it is a moment to moment process. There is still so much depth beyond letting go of the idea of yourself or recognizing that you're not what you think you are. There is still quite the process of going through understanding that just because you're not what you've always thought that you were doesn't mean that you're some other thing that you think you are. And along the way, we sort of settle upon different, depths to which we recognize that we are or aren't what we think we are. And through that, you get more and more free, but it doesn't mean that whenever you have that recognition, it's going to change everything immediately. Like, there's still going to be a process. It is still, as much as it is a one-step process, it does take time. You've built some insane habits over the last, however long you have thought objectively that you were always what you thought you were. And so it takes time to unravel those and kind of peel them back. And so I think it's cool. It really is cool, because as much as it's weird for me to go back and be like, oh man, I was really fucking stiff back then. It's kind of, I guess there's part of me that's like, it's hard to listen to, but at the same time, I know that was a part of my process and progress. And I am very grateful that is how things started. And that part of the conversation was had. And I was, as much as I had a lot of questions, I was also embodying the degree of freedom that I felt in myself along the way. And that's very palpable in the episodes. Like you can see it in the flow, like the things that you've said and the things that you've embodied haven't shifted as much, but I would say that our flow certainly has, and the freedom of this conversation and just the comfort with talking about anything and everything that we've discussed over the last year and a half has certainly shifted. So it's cool to see all of the different aspects sort of progressing. And there's going to be a point, probably in another year and a half, where I look at these episodes, be like, "Ooh, man, I was still kind of stiff and rigid back then," even though it's such a vast degree different than it was a year and a half ago. Now it's like it's always happening, and so you're always just doing your best and seeing things as well as you can and discussing them. So definitely don't get too caught up in trying to be super clear all the time. Just express yourself, and that, if anything, that's what's going to allow you to feel more freedom, is just going through the process of doing so. But you can't get from 0 to 100. It's like you got to take every step along the way, and it's important to remember that.
Oh my God, is it ever so important to remember that over and over and over and over again? Remember, especially as you're still going through concepts and trying to figure yourself out. There's a long process. There's infinite layers to this. It takes a long time to make that intuitive leap that you can actually just transcend the layers. You actually can just step outside the whole goddamn process, but you can't fake that. And it's not something that you can be like, "Oh, I'm just going to step outside the process," without practice. And I mean this sincerely. Like, I've been at this half my life, in my 40s. Just recently am I getting more and more glimpses of, oh, right, I don't have to do that. And it's not so much the process of going through all my thoughts and narrowing down the concepts and being clever or intelligent, because that all gets in the way. It really does. But it's a long process, and it's one that you should embrace that way. Like, constantly remember, like, right, however I'm describing this right now is just how I'm describing this right now. Right? Because you can get lost in that conceptual trap, right? Where you start to understand that everything's a concept, but then you can't let that go. That makes sense? Like, you start to question the nature of questioning. We talked about this before, right? Like, understanding that everything you think is a concept is great. Let it go. Like, just understand all of your thoughts are concepts. Everything that is an idea is a concept. Great. Perfect. Now you know that. That's it. Just watch for them. Right? Don't attach to them. You don't have to be more and more clever about that. You just need to master that. And that's just constantly going through it over and over and over again. It's really important to recognize that it's not about being clever. It's not about being able to say these things to other people and then walk away going, "Yeah, I really taught them something." It really isn't. Like, that's a temporary high. That's something that feels really good because maybe you're coming from a place where you didn't feel like you understood a bunch of stuff, which is fine, because it's a nice contrast to the feeling of, "Oh God, I'm confused. None of this makes any sense." And so you're starting to make sense of it. But it's so tempting to use all that as self-defining. It's really tempting to look at yourself and go, "Look how clever I am." Because I can wordsmith concepts. And that's not the same as applying them and being free. Right? Like, to recognize everything's a concept, you can say, "Well, that's a concept." Yeah. Okay. Or we could just stop there in reality, right? Before you start thinking about it again. And that's the practice, is that infinitesimally small point where you've stopped thinking, where you're not investing in the concepts. Not that you're telling yourself that's a concept, because eventually you're not going to have to do that, but you actually have that small period of time where you're free of all of it. And then you expand it. And you continue to expand that feeling over time until the majority of your life is free of concepts. And that's not a concept. See, I can use concepts to describe it, but the experience itself is what we're trying to describe. And none of the concepts describe the experience. They don't describe the reality. They're trying to, but the reality itself is something else, which is why concepts are useful until you recognize they're not reality. You can use them, but they will never be reality. So no matter how you try to describe it, it's always going to end up being inaccurate, which is why, and this is where we're going to go next, I think, I love paradoxes. I love a paradox because a paradox is not something that you can just wrap up and go, and there's the answer, right? Because it keeps looping in on itself. It's an endless process of looking at this paradox. And that's where your intelligence comes into play. That's where you actually start to expand your awareness, because you're not settling on any one thing. You're questioning all of it, because when you start to look at it, you start to realize that everything that's not paradoxical is oversimplified more often than not. So on that note, do we have free will, Andrew?
That is a fantastic question. I mean, yes and no. It completely depends on the perspective that you take. And so the discussion of free will, I think it's very common in our reality. It's something that, philosophers have touched on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And there's going to be a completely different conversation depending how you see yourself. And so for a very long time, people have discussed, and is my video coming through all right? It's not spotty at all? Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. For a very long time, like when you have the perception of yourself as something inherently separate from reality, the discussion of free will is still going to be paradoxical, but it almost becomes it does become a completely different conversation when you recognize that you aren't inherently separate from reality. So and what I used to talk about when I talked about free will, and I didn't recognize that I was just reality, that I thought I was this idea of what I think I am, separate from everything else, not one thread in the fabric of, the blanket of all of reality, was that I had free will because I could choose to do things, but everything that I chose was dictated by everything that's always been. And I didn't choose my parents, my upbringing, my past, whatever. So would I have always chosen that thing? Sure. But it's very much from the individual, dualistic, inherently divided perspective. So when you recognize that you are, the flesh of you is everything that has always been and always will be, that question of, the decision that you made being dictated, in a cause and effect sort of way from everything that's always been, and, your parents, how they raised you, but then you can go back to their parents and their parents and their parents and their parents. And for all of reality, basically you see that it comes back to here and now and where you're at, and not so much the control that you have, because that's going to be taken from the perspective of having an idea of what the outcome is going to be, and based on what, based on your preference of how you want things to go, and your limited perception. But when you see that you're not inherently divided, it's not so much an idea of whether or not you have control, but it's the influence you have on yourself as yourself, inherently connected to everything else. And so it's not even that you're having influence on anything else, because there is nothing else. It's just you're having influence. It's like I almost picture it like if you do recognize that all of your flesh is everything that you can see, interact with, do for all of eternity in all of infinite reality. It's just like a endless sort of blanket, and you're a thread in it. And as you do things, as you express not your will, but just be will here and now, it's like you kind of move the blanket up or down. And so it's not that you're something separate having impact on the rest of the blanket, but you are both the impactor and impacted. And so as we talk a lot about, it's about ripples. And so you kind of create a ripple through the blanket, but then everything else that is also you is also expressing will at all times. And so all of the other quote unquote threads that aren't really threads, because that implies some division too, but just, for this imagery, they're all kind of moving up and down, just doing things, expressing will here and now. And so they're all rippling as well. So all of the whole blanket is kind of rippling at once, but there's almost like not even any contrast anymore. There's the perception of contrast between the ripples, but they're all rippling simultaneously. So it's kind of like one ripple with infinitely smaller ripples at all times. And so you have free will and that you're making a ripple, but that ripple is simultaneously being impacted by all the other ripples that are happening. So none of the ripples are divided because they're all being impacted by the others. So everything and everyone else is expressing their free will, which is being impacted and impacting everything else all the time. And so because you're not disconnected, it's not so much you have control or a lack of control. You are will expressed here now. And so you have influence, but are also, being influenced at the same time. So the conversation of free will totally shifts. So anyway, those are some initial thoughts. I'll pass it to Ray now too.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. So here's another layer on top of that, let's just say. So when we're talking about this tapestry that we are, that there is no connection, that as you move, everything moves with you because it's all you. You just have the perception of separation, which is fine because that's where your experience comes from. And the same could be true for the cells in your body, right? Each and every cell in your body, each and every part of your body is doing its own thing. It's having its own experience. Does it have free will? Well, it's part of you. Does what you do influence it? Yeah. Does what it do influence you? Yeah. So is there free will? Because you're both connected, right? It's just a matter of perspective in terms of scale, right? This is me, my organ. This is me, my body. This is me, everything. And so even the word influence is kind of off. It's just the perspective of influence because we're a moving tapestry, right? It's not influence. We're just moving together. It's just that we have the perspective of individuality, which makes it very difficult to understand how that's just one thing moving together. But this is where you end up with that problem that you're like, oh, okay, well then if everything I'm doing is influenced by everything that came before me, then I have no free will. And it's like, yeah, okay. If this were a singular dimension in terms of reality just being this one timeline, but eternity and infinite versions of now and all of that conversation that we've had before. So what I mean is that you were saying earlier that when you look at somebody else's life and where they are, you go, okay, if I were that person, I would have done everything that they did. And that's true. But if you were to take another iteration of that person's life, that same person, well, so let's do the exercise again where, the universe started, universe ended, Earth came, went, blew up, whatever. Everything went to nothingness. And then eternity went by, another universe popped up, so on and so forth. And so we have infinite iterations of this universe and every other universe and so on and so forth over eternity. Okay. So same person that you would have done the same thing that they did in another variation of that lifetime, you would have done everything that they did too. See what I'm saying? So which one is what you would do? They all are. Each and every moment, you can do whatever you want. You can go in any direction that you want right now. And true, the direction you're most likely to go is going to be the direction of the current that you've been following based on your perception of it. That's the influence. But that doesn't dictate your action. You can go in any direction you want. And with awareness, you become aware of more and more directions, as well as the conditioning and the habits that keep you going in the same direction. And as you pivot, everything pivots with you. But the same is true for everything else. You're pivoting with it. The perception of division isn't there. Or rather, the perception of division is there, but the division itself is not. And so you have to consider that no matter what you do in your lifetime right now, there's always going to be a perfect universe where that's the appropriate thing to do. but you have access to each and every one of them in the here and now. They're all overlapping one another. All time exists now. It's not that you don't have free will. It's that there is nowhere to go except the expression of will. That's it. Like when we start thinking about the whole, and I wanted to read this because this is something that our friend Spencer had said earlier. This body alone has absolutely no free will. And there's that individual view again, right? But I have free will, or everything as a whole, the real me has free will. Everything as a whole isn't going anywhere. Everything is already whole. There's nowhere to go. So the idea of free will at that point is almost inaccurate because it's just will. It's just will. Every possible will that could be expressed is being expressed by us. This is the experience. That's all this is. And so it's really important to recognize that it's not that you, your body, have no free will. There is no you, your body. There's just the perception of you, your body. There's no separation. There's no separation. You are the whole. You are will, and everything will move with you as you express it. Yes, that means you can be influenced by it. But again, that comes down to your level of responsibility. And that's also the importance of responsibility. Nobody dictates how you respond. See, you can say they do. You can pass the buck. You can even for a time be influenced by others because you're not aware of that responsibility, that it's always on you, but it is nonetheless. That's the essence of responsibility. There is no one else to respond except you, which is will. That's what we are. We are will. It's just the idea of free will and predeterminism is really based on this idea of yourself versus the whole and how they're influencing one another, but it's not like that. It's a paradox.
Yeah, because so people still maintain, even through, the conversation, recognizing unity, there's still perception that, there's the, as Alan Watts puts it, like the spotlight versus floodlight consciousness. And it's like, yes, there is the perspective and the experience of I, but how you perceive that to be is going to differ. Like the weight on which you hold on to that individual perspective and think of that as you is going to impact the conversation very much so. Because people will recognize unity and then they'll still think that, oh yeah, but there's still me as something separate. And that's kind of what we're kind of like letting go of in this conversation. And as people still cling to that, there's still a clinging to that idea of you as something separate that completely shifts this conversation. Like you have to be able to let go of that idea of you, of that still, even if it's slight perception of division, like that's still taken as truth in a lot of the free will conversations. Like, oh yeah, unity is great and all, but there's still me. And so do I have free will? Like, that's not, you're it. Like, you're not that limited idea. You're not that thing that's separate in reality. That's the illusion. And so to actually have this discussion, we have to recognize what's an illusion and what isn't. Here and now is less less of an illusion, not the degree of an illusion that the idea of you is. And so there has to be, it's almost like there has to be work done before having this conversation. Like if you're going to have the conversation from the perception of division through taking an illusion to be the truth, you're just beating around the bush. Like until that's recognized that the illusion of you is not the reality of you, the idea of you is not the reality of you, it's hard to have to actually deepen into this conversation. But once you do, then the conversation almost doesn't seem as important or as relevant, because it's not so much, do I have free will or do I not have free will? It's like, no, you're just it. There's no you controlling anything or being controlled by anything. Like control, I mentioned this on Discord, but control isn't really a part of the conversation anymore once you let go of the illusions. But until you do so, there's the concern of control, because with the idea of you, the illusion of you, comes the illusion of control. And it's always going to be a part of the conversation as long as you cling to that idea of you, that you think you are, the illusion that you've always thought that you were, reinforced by the story, by the preferences, by the opinions, by the thoughts. But as you let go of those, it's not so much about the control. It's just about you being the expression of yourself in every single moment. So the cause and effect, the past dictating the present, creating the future, isn't so much, because there is no past or future or anything other than where you're at here now and the infinite number of potential opportunities they have to express that will. So,
yeah. But if I feel powerless day to day, then I'm going to perceive myself as being influenced by everything else. My brain is going to justify that powerlessness. It's really important to remember that. Often your view of free will is based on how you actually feel in your day-to-day life, because you're right. Philosophy is the disease for which it should be the cure, which we've said numerous times. And this is what I was saying earlier. It's great to be clever. It's great to be able to have this conversation and go down all the nooks and crannies, but how is it informing your here and now? How is it informing your life when you're not having that conversation? Are you enjoying the present moment? And I don't mean enjoying, but are you aligned with, are you actually in it? Or are you still going through all that internal dialogue, trying to figure out everything and define yourself in the process? Because ultimately that's the point, right? It's not about whether or not you have free will. It's whether or not you're exercising it. And that's really it. Like, this is why there was somebody who reached out to me on TikTok, and they're like, I would argue that there is no free will, and I'd love to have a debate with you that there is no free will. And I wrote back, no. And that's the answer, isn't it? If I had no free will, I wouldn't have been able to say that. It's not as simple as we would like it to be, but it's so important to recognize the danger of making it a philosophy and denying the obviousness of your experience. It's kind of like the non-duality crap with that. There is no me-ness. Who says so? Who said there was no me-ness? Who was that? Right? It's the same with, I have no free will. Who said that? How'd you say that? How'd you express that? Where'd the urge to say that come from? Somebody tell you to do it? Like, you're denying something that is obvious. It's you. The reasons why you do things are a different story, but it's still you doing them, right? You are will, and you are connected to everything else. And even that's inaccurate. Again, connected is incorrect. That's the thing. It still implies that separation's there. It's all you. And this is why Andrew, and again, if you haven't seen that episode of Raw, I'm not sure which one it was, where we were talking about how everything is essentially just your flesh. And that means that everything is connected. It's not what you perceive it to be. It really is all connected to you. You're just focused on a very small part of you, thinking that it's separate from everything else, but it all moves together regardless of your focus, all the time.
yeah. And so because in all of these conversations, we have the perspective of you, perspective of me. And it's not about denying the meanness, like we've talked, like Ray brought up with the non-duality crowd, but it's recognizing how limited of a meanness that you've held on to for so long. Because when you recognize that it's all, as we talked about in that Raw episode, like it's all your flesh, like you are an expression of your flesh. You are a cell within the body of reality, but all the cells are reality no differently. And if all of the cells in your body started thinking that they were not also the body, they would start acting independently and you would die very quickly. And so when we say it's there is the perspective of you, but it's not cut off by the limited idea. Like there's still, like, if one of the cells, cells did exist independently in the body and they were able to kind of look out, like the cell in this part of my hand was looking out and it was talking to the cell right here. And it was like, there is no me, like there is no meanness. And the other one's like, well, yeah, but then who am I talking to? Like, well, me. But what this one doesn't get is, just because there's no me doesn't mean there isn't the perspective of me from the recognition of being the whole body. Like you can recognize, it's like if me and Ray are these two cells and we're like, no, it's not that there's no you, like it's still you having this perspective, but you've just always thought for so long that you were just this cell. And now you're trying to deny it because you experienced some trauma from that perspective. And now it's easier to just suppress that idea. It's not about that. It's about expanding that recognition and realizing that you are the entire body and you have will to have influence over the body, but it doesn't discount the fact that you're being influenced as well by the rest of the body. Like if the body, the cells in the shoulder start getting sick or something, it starts to spread. Like these cells could be impacted by that, illness or injury. Even like sometimes you get injured in your shoulder and you feel it in your fingers because they're connected, but that doesn't discount the fact that these also impact the shoulder, and maybe these cells getting healthier could help heal the shoulder over here because those aren't disconnected either. And so taking it from the perspective, I think it's very difficult, the recognition of unity, because we have the perception of division and it's so solidified, like it feels so real. So taking it from the perspective of cells in the body, we're able to recognize it more easily because we can see the connection, like between me and Ray right now, we're, I don't know, probably 3,500 miles apart, but everything in between us is the same essence of me. We just perceive, the space in between, but that's like, the space between my fingertip and my nose. Like it's that exact same thing. It's that same perspective. And so it's going to have influence over each other. It's like if the finger was here looking at the nose and it'd be like, see, we're separate. And it's like, doesn't see all of this, but also realize that all the space in between my nose and finger made out of the same stuff too. And so when it comes to free will, it's recognizing that you're not just that limited idea of that cell, but it doesn't deny the fact that you have the perspective of that cell. But through recognizing that you're the entire body, the idea of free will is a completely different conversation. And it's not so much about, what control do I have? Like if this cell was like, what control do I have on reality, or how am I being controlled by reality? It's like, okay, well, the finger moves. It's like you're a part of that movement. It's not that you're controlling it or being controlled. Like you're as much quote unquote deciding to move the finger as all of the other cells, but you're experiencing the movement differently than the nose would, but it doesn't mean that you're not the body. So hopefully that's coming across. I think it does, because it's just easier seeing the connection. I think the sight of the disconnect gets in the way of a lot of this conversation, but the conversation just completely shifts as that perspective of me shifts from thinking you're just the cell to recognizing you're the body, but also having the perspective of the cell. But in no way does that mean that you're something separate from the body.
That's interesting, because really the question of control comes from the perspective of division. The more divided you feel, the more you want to know, how much control do I have? Right? Somebody actually said in the chat, like, well, you guys are aware, make lightning strike and perform a miracle and all that stuff. And it's like, see, that's kind of the thing. Like, you're looking at it as a single cell should be able to drive the whole machine. But what if it's about the cells recognizing that they're the whole body and working together as a result, right? Actually being able to perform miracles simply because they're no longer miraculous, because there's enough energy and enough complexity and enough attention and focus to make it possible, as opposed to one person feeling like quote unquote God, because there is no one person. It's all one thing, right? And so it makes it really important to recognize, I think, being receptive to the response that your will, quote unquote, gets is a part of the evolution process. Like this question of do I have control comes from a state of mind that is unable to recognize itself in other people, right? There's still that question of me, the individual. How do I have control? And in getting rid of that perception of other people, you become more receptive to quote unquote other people. So what I mean is you become less fixated on yourself. And so you become more sensitive to what happens as a result of what you do, right? Because everybody is you. So just like Andrew was saying, if I were to do something as a single cell in this body and it creates a ripple and the body responds in kind. Well, often if I'm focused on what I want, on my will, my control, all that, I get kind of bitter and pissed off about how the body responded in kind, because I don't see that it's me teaching me that in aligning with it, I'm actually allowing myself to be more aligned with the rest of me. And it's because I'm focused on control rather than alignment, rather than just being what I already am. So it's not about performing miracles so much as recognizing that you already are and just getting out of the way, right? But it really is recognizing the response is a part of your will as well, right? Somebody was asking here in the chat, so if I went out on a murderous rampage, that would be my will expressed. It's like, right. And as would be the response to that. You can do whatever you want, understand, but reality is going to respond in kind as you would, because it's you. In the same way that your body is its own thing, but when you get sick, other parts of your body come out to fight and come out to regulate that. It's the same is true with the whole. If you go out and you cause harm willy-nilly because you think, oh, this is what I want to do right now, it's coming from a place of disconnection. The body's going to respond in kind, like an immune system. It's all one thing, right? It's all your will. It's just that you have a limited view of what that means because you're looking at yourself, the piece of the whole, instead of yourself, the whole expressed in pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. I think seeing it from the perspective of cells in a body, like if it's easy to see the impacts and impactedness of the cells in a body because we still perceive them as having separate kind of iterations, but that's not even true to us as much. Like it's still, some division being perceived there. But I think it gets us sort of closer there. And again, like we were talking about before, concepts are never going to be the reality of it. And even recognizing that, like we can talk about how everything is a concept forever. You can have that conversation literally for all of eternity, but all you got to do is recognize that those concepts are never the truth. Even the concept of discussing concepts not being reality is a concept, sure. And then it's like, and then you can drop it, and then we can continue having more conversations about things other than, being stuck on that. So if you pictured, going back to cells in the body, if they were kind of having conversations with each other, if they started philosophizing, it would be kind of strange. It'd be kind of interesting if two cells were like asking each other, do I have free will? And then because they thought they were just cells, and then another came around and recognized that it was, the whole body. And it was like, well, I mean, what do you think you are? And they're like, well, I'm the cell, of course. It's like, look around. Do you not see what you really are? And it's like that recognition, it just changes all of it. And so it kind of stops the conversation in its tracks, like through that recognition. It's not to say you can't have it, but the answer, I don't want to say it becomes more obvious, like it becomes less of a discussion, but it's just kind of like, what do you mean? There's no division anywhere between anything. There's no division between moments. There's no division between events. There's no division between space and you and anything else. So your will, it's not something you own. You don't have will, you express it, like you are it. You don't manifest things. You are the manifestation. Like you're it happening. You are one with the happening, just like things are happening to you and you're happening to them. It's just kind of, they all blend together into just here and now happening. What are you going to do with it? What do you want to do with it? If we can keep talking about the different perspectives that we can take and, you know, getting lost in the illusion of division, the perception of division kind of creates the conversation and the questioning that can go on endlessly about free will. But once you recognize that that's not the truth, that the idea of you is not the reality of you, that you're not limited to this idea that you've always thought you were, divided from everything, like you're just it. There is nothing else to have impact over. Like you are the impact, always here and now, always being had.
That's really interesting, because we are will, right? But our will changes according to our perception of ourselves to some degree. And what I mean is, we've talked about this before, how when you perceive yourself to be an individual and separate, it only makes sense to try and feel in control. It only makes sense to be comparative and competitive, because you're separate. You need to survive. You need to protect yourself. But as you start to recognize it's all you, not conceptually, genuine recognition, well, all of a sudden your will changes. I don't know if it changes so much. Maybe it's just not as distorted. Maybe it was this all the time, except distorted by your fear. But all of a sudden your will is just for the whole. That's why everybody who goes down this path at a certain point, they're just like, I just want to keep giving. I just want to serve. I just want to get out of the way. And it's because your perspective of you being separate has disappeared, or rather it's vanishing. And as a result, you're acting more as part of the whole. That's interesting. You still experience it as your own individual will. Of course you would, right? But it's just the fact that your will is more reflective of the state of recognition that you're embodying. I think that's what changes our will. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does, for sure. Like it becomes less about, I mean, the deeper and deeper you go, the more the conversation shifts and the less it is about the conversation. Like the more it is just about what you're doing with it. And the conversation almost shifts away from trying to figure things out to just talking about whatever the fuck you want to talk about. And that's why we talk about so many different topics, as much as we love going deep and talking about certain things. And, you know, free will has been something coming up a lot recently in Discord and other parts of our community. So we definitely want to chat about it. But there comes a point where it's less so about trying to figure it out when you recognize that there isn't anything to figure out, and just be it at some point. Just like at some point you're just like, you just shut up and you just be the experience, because you've recognized more and more clearly that you're just it, that you are it. And so it's like, what do you want to do with it? Do you want to keep beating around the bush, trying to figure out or go deeper, when really that's just there comes a point where people just utilize that to try and define themselves further and feel more valuable, because they're still very much perceiving themselves as something separate. They still very much see themselves as something within everything, even having the perspective of being connected to everything isn't it. Because connection implies, the potential for division. Yes. If you start feeling less connected, there's a disconnect. And it's like, no, there's no connection or disconnection. Those don't exist. There's the perspective. If you have a limited idea of yourself, you can feel like, there's connection and therefore could possibly be a disconnection, but there's no things that could be connected. It's not even there aren't things that could be connected. Like, it's just it. And it's not even one thing. It's just it. There's no bounds to it. So it's not one. It is for eternity, infinitely, forever. And so through that, the conversations completely shift. Like, you can keep going deeper into what that means, but it becomes more of a balance than a focus. Yes. And you kind of go back and forth between questioning things and wondering things and talking about the depths of this to what do I want to eat for lunch today? I'm gonna make something new, try something new. And that's what it becomes more about. Like, it comes full circle. Chop wood, carry wood. I almost said chop water, carry wood. Wait. I don't even know how that goes anymore. I just confused myself. That statement, chop wood, carry water. There it is. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So you kind of just like go through this process and you have a completely different perspective on everything, but the things you do aren't so different than you were doing before you maybe recognized it. And it becomes, you recognize that that's just it, is how fully you can be where you're at and focused on what you're doing, as opposed to trying to conceptualize the idea of concepts being conceptualized or whatever that means.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? Like, the only thing that really changes is that you get to live your life now. For you get to live your life, and without the doubt and the fear, the worry, all the strings pushing you back and forth just because you don't know that you're already everything and not complete. Like, that's the whole thing. You're just free of all of that inner narrative. It's not like it doesn't exist. You just don't take it as truth. And that's really the only difference. You're actually in what you're doing. And that's more or less why we're having this conversation. But it's so tempting to think that just because Andrew and I are having this conversation, that the conversation is the point, right? The conversation is helpful. The conversation is important because a lot of us don't have this conversation. And so the ability to start getting into this stuff without being judged, the ability to question things, the ability to have this dialogue is all really important. But outside of the dialogue, what are you doing with it? Because when I'm not here chatting with Andrew, or I'm not talking to one of our community members or doing a one-on-one session or anything like that, I'm pretty quiet. Like, I go for a walk, I sit, I enjoy the feeling of the sun on my face. I talk to somebody on the street. I'm fully immersed in the conversation I'm having with them about whatever it is they want to talk about. It's not like I'm out there constantly having this conversation about higher minded stuff at all, because it's fun to have that conversation. It's informative to have that conversation, but it should be informing what you do in between, which is your state of peace, right? Your own state of contentedness and fulfillment in the here and now, right? So it's important to have the conversation, sure. And I wanted to say this very quickly. Andrew and I have this conversation 5 days a week, and we do groups and so on and so forth for a very specific reason. Not because the conversation is the point, but because it's a podcast, for one, which means that if we just sat here not saying anything, nobody would listen. The second point is quite simply, as I said, this conversation doesn't happen enough. It hasn't been happening for a very long time. And it's because we'll have little pockets of humanity emerge and start having this conversation. And where before they used to be, murdered and burned at the stake, society is just not very accepting of this conversation because we're at a certain developmental level collectively. And so the conversation often dies, or it gets railroaded, or it ends up getting taken over by ego, and it becomes about profit and all of that other stuff. And so if there's anything Andrew and I are doing, we're just keeping the discussion going. That's all we're doing. We're sitting in a room, making sure the conversation is here for anybody who wants to enter the room. But don't stay in the room. Go outside. Live. Let the conversation inform your life. We're going to stay here and keep doing this so you can come back when you want to. You can even send people back this way so they can maybe experience a bit more of the conversation, so they can leave the room and experience more of what's out there too. But understand, that's all we're doing here. We're just keeping the conversation going until it catches fire and it starts being in more and more places, more and more available to more and more of us, more and more of you. And that's how we change. But the conversation is only part of it. It's what you do with it. It's how you apply it. It's whether or not you're willing to serve. It really is. And I say service just because that is possibly the most offensive thing to the ego. It really just doesn't like the idea of letting go.
Yeah, I absolutely love having this conversation, but I also recognize that it's not the point of it. Like it is very much a large part of our week because there is so much to talk about. We don't always harp on, you know, the nitty gritty of it. We'll get deep for sure, but even, you know, when we have guests or in the groups, it's not like, you know, we force everyone into this certain specific type of conversation. Like we very much want to see with guests, like how they've applied things in their life and what they've learned in their life, and kind of we're eventually able to tie things all together. But, you know, outside of these conversations, I'm happy to have it with everyone, with anyone and everyone. And I will, for fun, bring it up here and there, but it's not every aspect of my day is surrounding, you know, trying to figure out these things or conceptualize or get caught up in even just the recognition that concepts are never truth, and it's important to recognize that. But like what I'm saying is there comes a point where it's like, live your life, you know, and with my friends, when I'm with it, like I'll do, you know, watch sports and talk to them about sports and stuff. And there has been parts of me where I've thought like, this is really lame. Like there are times where like, I don't want to be doing it. And so I won't, but at the same time, like if someone's really caught up and enthusiastic, like if I'm with one of my friends who's a huge fan of a certain sports team, like I'm just very intrigued by them and I want to learn more about, you know, the team and what's going on and blah, blah, blah. And it's like my attention is there and it's fully there, and it's not thinking, you know, it's not clinging to opinions about what it is, even though I may not be, you know, I grew up playing a ton of different sports and it was always a big part of my life. I was never necessarily a huge fan of any teams, but it was definitely a massive part of my life. But that's, you know, another way to experience yourself and have enjoy the experience, and to think that going through the philosophizing of all of this is the right way to live, or more people should be doing so, is clinging to that opinion and preference, and going to continue to cut you off from the freedom that's available when you finally let go of that perspective too, that this is the best way to spend it. Like I've gone through lots of ups and downs with getting caught up and thinking that this is, you know, the best way to spend it, that more people should be thinking about these things. And it's really not about that, because once you get to a point in this conversation, you realize it was never really about that, but it can be a helpful way for people to let go of some of their shit, but to a point, because as soon as you start clinging to this, it's just the same as clinging to anything else. Just the same as clinging to anything else. It's not that this is a quote unquote better thing to cling to. Anything you cling to. And so that's the practice. And that's the thing with the ego. It's a sneaky motherfucker, that devil of identity, of attaching to certain things, is one sneaky motherfucker. Like it can take these conversations and turn it into another thing that you're attaching to no differently than you had always been attaching to that idea of yourself and all of your fears and worries and things that created all of your suffering for so very long. So even when you start getting caught up in this conversation, like, again, not to say there's anything wrong with it, but to think that it's the end all be all, the conceptualization, the conversation, the I don't know, feeling of smartness that comes from being able to express things clearly isn't about it either. That's just as much a trap as any of the other things that we attach to or identify with.
Nicely said. Yeah. If you meet the Buddha in the road, kill it. Right? Because it is. Every time you get to that conceptual truth, aha, this is it. It's not. You know, it might be a tool. This is why we say, this is why we were saying earlier on, like, they're tools. Use them. Never commit to them. Never be afraid to let them go or question them or change them or let them adapt and evolve over time. It's really important, right? Because there is no conceptual truth. That's the thing the brain hates. It's like, I got to settle on a truth. You don't actually just live, because that's what this is, living. Right? It's just interesting how much of a soundtrack we have over that life. That's it. It's just the practice of getting out of that soundtrack or recognizing that it's there, right? That it's not necessarily all there is. And I think that's really all this is about, to me, anyway, admittedly. Like, as much as I enjoy the high-minded conversations about free will and time and space and all that other fun stuff, the fact is that for me, this is more of a personal thing. Like, I spent so long in that hell that the recognition, oh, that's not me. Oh, the thing I'm thinking about is actually not me. It's just an idea of me. Holy, what? That set me free, changed my life. To me, that's the only fucking point. This is all fun. Don't get me wrong. Okay. But that suffering, that's the thing that's important to me. The recognition that the narrative, the illusion that you're participating in, because you don't recognize that it's not truth, because your brain is doing it on its own out of necessity, that whole thing, that's all I want. It's all I want in general, is just to let you know it's not what you think it is, and it's optional. It really is. As a point of focus, it's optional, that you can actually step outside of it and live. Just live your life. You can be in what you're doing for the sake of what you're doing. You can say what you want to say for the sake of saying what you want to say. And that doesn't mean you lack sensitivity. It means you actually get past that point where you need to say anything. See, that's it, right? Just live your life. But so much of what we do in terms of living comes from need and fear and awkwardness and a feeling of disconnect and a sense of lack and all that stuff. But none of that is reality itself. Reality is here and now. So I always say, like, in the here and now, there really aren't any problems. There's just you here and now. Right. And what do you want to do with that? But it's the mind. The mind creates problems. You know, it's like Shakespeare. Nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Yeah, exactly. That's a powerful one for sure. But yeah, a lot of times we kind of create our own problems and conflict with reality through that thinking and that perception and whatnot. Someone asked, if you meet the Buddha in the road, kill it. What does that mean? Exactly. So for me, it's the settling upon an answer, settling upon an idea that, oh, I've figured it out. Oh, this is it. I've got it. And holding on to that, because as soon as you're holding on to that, it's not it. You know, as soon as you think you've gotten it, it's no longer it. As you hold on to that, it just becomes an idea. It becomes another concept. Oh, I got it. This is what it's all about, guys. Listen to me. I figured it out. And it becomes something you identify with, something that builds you up, boosts that ego, makes you feel better because you get it and someone else doesn't. Now you can explain it to people and, you know, be clear about things. And it very much is, you know, wolf in sheep's clothing, the idea that you have it figured out, or even the idea that you're potentially the idea that you're figuring it out, that you're getting closer to it, can be very destructive, because it's always going to be, it's a process nowhere. It's a journey nowhere. There is no figuring it out. There is no having it figured out. It's just the process of being it and experiencing it. And if you have the perspective that you're figuring it out, it means that there is a point in which you have it figured out. You think there is a Buddha in the road. And then, so the Buddha in the road, if you see the Buddha in the road, kill it. Eventually you get to that point. You're like, oh shit. Oh, it wasn't, there was nothing to figure out. And you could argue there's a process of figuring out that there's nothing to figure out. But again, that's something that can go on for eternity, that conversation. And so understanding that anytime you utilize anything, a conversation, an understanding of things to feel better about yourself, like be very, very wary of that. Be very careful of those things that you hold on to try and build yourself up. Because as soon as it gets questioned or someone comes around and questions you, you feel like you're getting torn down all of a sudden. And if your value is fluctuating based on that, it's definitely going to be some severe consequences to that eventually, unavoidable, as you cling to certain ways of existing to feel like you're more valuable. So it's a letting go of those. It's a recognizing that value doesn't shake or waver. So just try some new things, dig into stuff, experience things, and stop talking so much sometimes. Just stop and just be where you're at for a bit. As I said, try some new stuff and just be in that. And you may realize that the conversation and the discussion of concepts and whether or not concepts or truth is concept, like, that was never as important. It was never as impactful or as influential as you thought. Really, it was just, allowing you to feel a little bit better temporarily, but taking you further from the genuine recognition.
I always really enjoyed the expression, if you meet the Buddha in the road, kill it. And it's just because it sounds so contradictory, which is the point, right? Because when you think about the Buddha, you get this picture of enlightenment and peace and love and that whole thing. And then when you think about killing something, it's very violent. And so there's a direct contradiction. And the reason is because Buddha isn't Buddha. See, that's the whole point. Your idea of Buddha wasn't what Buddha was. That's what Buddha was saying. Find your Buddha nature. Find your nature, because that's my nature. Right? So everybody's idea of Buddha wasn't Buddha. It isn't Buddha. Everybody has an idea of Buddha as this picture of enlightenment, but he was just you. Right? There is no Buddha in the way that we're looking at it. The concept is not the reality, which is why when you meet the Buddha in the road, what you're really seeing is this picture of enlightenment, that picture of like, this is it. This is the golden truth. This is the path. This is and all of that. And it never is. It never is, because as soon as it's an attachment, you're no longer free. And that's the reason that you have to watch out for the wolves in sheep's clothing. Those who would tell you that they're the Buddha, those that would tell you that this is the path. Andrew and I are just talking about the process of being process. There's no path to follow. You are the path. It's the entire point. The question is, how do you want to walk it? Do you want to walk it with your eyes shut, walking into things, wondering why it hurts? Or do you want to open your eyes? Maybe take in some shit that you didn't think was there, maybe some shit that you didn't want to be there, and then adapt and walk through your life with your eyes open. It's really the only question. There's no point. It really comes down to you. You can live your entire life in egotism. You can live your entire life focused on what you want, being selfish, as it were, focused on the limited idea of you. You can do that, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. But for a long time, that's how we got here, is through so many of us investing in that path. There's nothing wrong with it, but it has a consequence, and our body responds. And if we don't listen to our body responding, that generally goes bad for us. It changes the environment, which is when we start to respond, right? Just like when you're sick, you may not take care of your body until one day you catch a cold, and all of a sudden you're out there buying vitamin C and all kinds of other fun stuff that you could have been buying before you got sick. It really comes down to how long are you going to wait?
And no one's going to force you to be open your eyes or be more aware or whatever. And no one's going to do it for you. And a lot of people are actually going to convince you that it's better to keep them closed. And it's better to, keep wondering, keep questioning, because maybe they say that they have the answers for you. Just follow them. And if we're ever saying anything, it's don't do that. Don't think of us that way. Certainly, we're in the same boat as you. Just being it. And it's just your willingness to let go of that comfortable, but, root of your suffering, that comfortable perception of yourself. Like, how willing are you to let that go, and to what degree? Because that kind of dictates your entire experience. And this whole conversation totally shifts when you are willing to look that in the face and recognize, oh, this isn't me, and I don't have to keep clinging to it. And so your experience no longer comes down to how well you can build it, or how much you can gain, or how well you can discuss these things, because you realize there is nothing to build. So you can do it for fun, but that process eventually gets less fun, I guess, when you realize that it's not actually building something. Like when you're just doing it for the sake of doing it and just being it for the sake of being it. Nowhere to get, nothing to be, nothing to prove, nothing to validate, and nothing to lose. There's a shift in the desires that come with that. And it really does expand beyond yourself, expands beyond that limited idea of yourself. And because, with the conversation and the conceptual, like if you're having it from the limited idea of you and think that it means something about you and that it's going to build the idea of yourself, you're very much caught up in you, and you're not seeing the rest of yourself. And so you're blind to the lack of impact that you have by just conceptualizing everything and continuing to have the conversation, continuing to philosophize. You're blinded almost to the lack of impact. And again, not to say that you should have impact on, others, quote unquote, others, other iterations of you, the rest of reality, but it's just a shift in feelings and recognizing that in each moment you have the potential to do anything. And it's what do you want to do with it? And depending how you see yourself is going to dictate how you want to see that. And when you're very much caught up in the conceptual discussion of it and the philosophy and the reasoning and utilizing that as a source of value to feel better, you're limiting your impact or influence. Like it's not really going anywhere. Not to say that it's going anywhere ever, but I don't know. Everything just kind of shifts when you start to see things differently. And the conversation of free will completely changes when you recognize the reality of what you are.
Yeah, it does. And it changes how you have that conversation. Like I said, for me, I was all gung ho, man. I thought I was super clever. I was pretty good at talking about all of this stuff. And then it really just came down to, right, but who am I trying to convince? And that one hit me hard. It really did. Like it just kept hitting me. Right. It's not about other people at all. It's about me. If I wasn't totally good with my life as a whole, with my existence, I wouldn't be doing this. It took me a long time to even consider doing this again. the conversation getting out because of the temptation, because of the danger, in terms of people grasping on the conceptual stuff. And more importantly, me feeling more important because I'm so good at this conceptual stuff, right? So I had to get rid of all that stuff. It really just had to be about me living my life and being happy and fulfilled and content and whole and all that other fun stuff. And I am. I just happen to enjoy this conversation, right? There's nowhere to go. I'm not trying to get anywhere. I'm certainly not trying to save the world, but I'm changing direction because I can, because I am will. I am part of the body. I have every right to do so. The only thing I'm watching is the response of that body. And admittedly, the response of that body has changed over 20 years, right? At first, it was like an immune response to the recognition that we are not our individual cells. All of a sudden, the body's like, I don't like that. Shut that shit down, right? It was like out of Inception when all the characters in the dream start recognizing that you're the dreamer and they all just come after you, right? It was basically what it was like. The immune system of this egotistical body hates this conversation, but that's changing. And it's changing because I'm not going anywhere. And there's more and more of me recognizing what I am. And that's it. And the conversation will continue to change. The body will continue to change so long as, again, we focus on alignment rather than force, rather than control. Understanding that what's best for the body is the recognition that you are the body. That's it. It's not forcing it to do what you want. It's aligning with it. So that way you can have at least the clarity to just live free of that distortion, of that cancerous mentality that's dragging us down. It's really all it's about. It's about how you live. The rest is just fun, right? The rest is just conversation for the sake of facilitating your change, right? But the change itself, you experience in your moments by yourself, especially. That's why I embrace those moments. Take those moments of silence. Remember, there's no one to convince. Nobody needs to get this. It's just you.
Yeah, that was one that hit me pretty hard recently, was that there's no one to convince, and there's nothing you have to do to convince anyone. You don't have to spend your time trying to get people to get this or wishing that they got this, because you get to a point where you realize, like, fuck, I'm just creating a lot of suffering for myself right now by wanting others to get this, by expecting them to get this, by thinking there's a point where you're so clear that you can just convince everyone to get it, because that's not it. And I was talking to my brother a little bit this weekend about this conversation and just our process of having the podcast and spreading the word and whatnot. And he was like, I really think if you guys, tried to explain it more in simpler terms, you might reach like a broader audience or whatever. And I was like, I totally hear what you're saying. And if we did spend all of our time in that space of just trying to make it as simple, as clear and try and curate it in a way that's applicable to as many people as we can, it would be distorted to a great degree, as well as our energy would be distorted to a great degree. And so from the egotistical, divisive sort of perception of division type mentality, that makes sense to try and get everyone to understand it, and saying the message in whatever way, shape, or form you can in order to maximize the following, basically the amount of people listening. And because that is what, logically makes sense. If we make our money from having a certain amount of people listening, like, do everything we can to maximize listeners. Like, in a capitalistic society, profit is going to be tried to be had at all costs, even the cost of the environment that you exist within, that's partially dictating your experience. It's like it's a monster in and of itself. And so our goal isn't that. It's not about maximizing it for ourselves. It's about maximizing it for ourselves as reality. And so it's not something that we can just shift or try and distill so clearly that more people get it, because there's an energy with that that's going to distort the whole message. Like if we spent, like we'll mention here and there, like, if you're enjoying this conversation, whatever, like that, we really don't mention it on the podcast. Actually, I'll mention it on my videos here and there. If you enjoy this, check out Dualistic Unity. But it's a balance. It's a tricky balance that isn't understood by the divisive mentality, by the collective egotistical mentality. Like, why don't you guys mention, follow more often, or make sure, if we spend every episode, like after my intro, I was like, make sure to smash that subscribe button if you're enjoying the conversation. Like, there's just a totally different energy to that, because it isn't so much about that. And it's not about doing it for the sake of us. It's about doing it for the sake of you. And so what are you deriving from the conversation? And it's so much a balance that we push people to stop listening to a point, because that's the impact. We want the impact. We want to be able to utilize this as a ripple in reality, but not be it, because if we were doing that, then we would start being seen as quote unquote, in the phrase, if you meet the Buddha in the road, kill it. We would start being seen as the Buddha. And so we're telling people to kill it, telling people to kill the idea of dualistic unity, kill your attachment to this conversation. Come and go as you please, as you see fit, in order to create a better life for yourself, or a freer life, not even better, but just freer existence and experience. But it's not about that endless gain at all costs. Like there's very much has to be a balance with this conversation, like, the discussion versus the experience. Like, is the discussion informing your experience or taking away from your experience? Is this conversation, an expression of the freedom that we feel in ourselves, or is it taking away from the freedom we feel in ourselves? If we feel like we need to use it in order to get somewhere, aka more free, like, then it's just taking away from it. Yeah, we want this to be something that we can just do every week and have the conversation, and not have to worry about, doing one-on-ones or whatever on top of it so much. But if we pushed that, too quickly, our energy along the way would be so distorted that it would kind of crumble in itself. It would topple before we got there. It's like, it has to be an expression of freedom along the way, and allowing the chips to fall as they may. And so that's what we can't talk about this stuff and not embody it along the way, or it's going to be distorted. So I know I was talking about like what my brother brought up, but I don't know exactly how I got to that. But anyway, like, the conversation has to be an expression of your own freedom, just like this podcast is for us, just like everything. And if it isn't, if it's for an ulterior motive, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. You're actually cutting down your freedom, as opposed to using it as a way of expressing your freedom.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. And I think that that's really important for our audience and our community to know. And I know a great many of them do. So I'm certainly not referring to everyone, but it's like L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, said before he died, if I wanted to be rich, I would start a religion. Which is kind of funny considering what came after, right? And that's it, is that because this show, this podcast, this community, this conversation, because I don't want and don't feel any lack in myself, because I'm not trying to teach anything or anything like that. It really is about the conversation. And I take that very seriously. And I appreciate the fact that Andrew does as well. And he has since the very beginning, that it's never been about Andrew feeling better about himself or Andrew putting himself on a pedestal. And I know, because I've tested the waters here and there. I've asked him little questions like, how you doing? And he every time he brings himself back down to ground level. And that's why we continue to work together, because it is so very important to me that we not add to the distortion just out of fear. You know, that's why we spent 16 months doing this before we ever turned on to full time, right? It's because, and I know I'm a sales and marketing guy. I have been for a long time. It is so counterproductive to tell people who are following you to not follow you because it's not in their best interest. That is not a marketing campaign. This is not something that you do if you want to make a great deal of money at all. But it is something you do if the message and the person that you're talking to is what's important to you, about the integrity of your message, that you're not just self-soothing, you're not doing it just for you, that you actually are doing it from a state of recognition and fulfillment. It's so important to do that. And while I know we mentioned Patreon and we mentioned our workshops, and we do try to create as many opportunities to get together as possible, we really are trying to do it for as little as possible. We really are trying to do as much as we can without necessarily bowing to corporate sponsors and whatnot, and trying to sell products that we don't believe in and don't want. It really is just a matter of doing it the hard way, because in doing it the hard way, at least we know the foundation, right? It really does come down to that. And this is true with your life, right? Going through the experiences, we talk about this all the time, going through things the hard way is sometimes the best way for you to find out more about yourself, right? This journey of dualistic unity for me is an expression of everything I've ever learned about myself. So the integrity in terms of the point and the conversation and my own state of mind is very important to me. More important by the recognition that any distortion on my end will impact you. And so I really just try and keep that in mind. But to do that, we have to let go of everything that everybody tells us in terms of marketing the podcast, getting in front of those clients, building up that revenue stream. It's not that we don't want to, because we have fantastic ideas. Oh my God. But time. The foundation's more important than the speed with which you build. Right. And I'll use the example actually, because I wanted to mention this. I have mentioned Mr. Beast in the past and his fixation on the entertainment side of things, which is just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I've often expressed it would be great if he did something with that towards the whole. Mr. Beast just sponsored 1,000 cataract surgeries. He just helped 1,000 people get their eyesight back. That's incredible. And now he's asking on Twitter, like, why don't governments do this? Why aren't we doing? Because we're wrapped up in ourselves, Mr. Beast. And I left a comment on that tweet specifically that we're so busy trying to survive and seeing ourselves as separate, it doesn't even dawn on us that we can take care of other people. And that's the point. And as we start to learn that, which is really what this conversation's about, then that intention will start to grow, and more resources will become available. Maybe we'll even talk to Mr. Beast at some point and do something huge for the world, because it really is just about all of us coming to that realization that we can on our own, for ourselves, not because we should, not because it makes us a guru, not because it makes us moral, not because of any of that shit that puts us up on an invisible pedestal, but because we're free and it just makes sense.
Yeah. I would say Mr. Beast is, when it comes to someone who does think of themselves as inherently separate from everything, is a pretty good example of the possibilities that you can do. And I mean, that example for sure, but he's someone like, I've seen some of his interviews and watched a couple of his videos, not a whole lot, but from my understanding, like, he really doesn't hold on to much for himself. I mean, he's just like, his thing is YouTube videos. That's all he cares about. It seems like he really doesn't feel the need to have much outside of the ability to just do that. And so he doesn't have that much, despite making like millions, tens of millions of dollars over the last number of years. Everything just reinvests into that, to now that he has, like, you know, a valuation of like $1 billion or something. And so it's pretty cool now that he has built this, and he is, you know, every video probably brings in a shitload of money, that he's like, holy shit, I can have impact on these things. And that's really cool, because that is not very common, but it makes sense for him, because he's never been so caught up in himself and like, oh, I want to do this to, you know, get a nice car or a big house or whatever. Like it's more so I want to create videos. So it's still, limited to a degree, but I think with that, there is, the altruistic sort of like being an entertainer. Like this is for people to watch. And so now being at a point where he does have tons of money and is worth a ton of money and all of that, like it makes sense that the next step is, that's all kind of figured out, making the videos. That's great. Where else can we put this? And so that's really cool, because that's where we see all of this going. It's like, we're just going to keep having the conversation. Everything we do is pretty low cost. We don't, like, our YouTube videos, the podcast episodes, they're not costing like he does, hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes. So our cap on things is very low in terms of what we need, especially relative to Mr. Beast for his sort of production. And then beyond that, it's like, we're going to be able to start figuring out. We're already wondering, what can we do to help ourselves as reality? Things like, 1,000 cataract surgeries. That's fucking incredible. But beyond that, just like however many ways, and once we're set with things, that's going to be the focus, is what impact can I have on this reality? Because when it comes down to it, we brought this up before, but like, it's selfish in the sense that we're experiencing our environment, and we have to exist in a world that we can actually have impact on. Like, we can change the environment, and people don't recognize that. They're so focused on themselves that they don't realize that they can have impact on their environment, which shifts their reality as well. It shifts their individual experience, just the same as buying themselves something. And really, like, there comes a point with buying yourself stuff that you're just kind of perpetuating the suffering. You're reinforcing it. There's no end to that void. You keep trying to fill it with things for yourself. And it's never been about that. There is no fullness of a void that you can fill through other things, through materialistic objects, or even validation from others, or emotions from others. It has to be in yourself, for yourself. And recognizing that idea of you that perpetuates that void and all of that lack isn't the reality of you. And so that void that you've always felt isn't even there. That's been an illusion as well. And so as that goes, why there's not so much to need, because there's nothing to fill, because it's already full, because it was never really there. So that's why this conversation, I find, is so important, because that's a recognition that you eventually get to, that there was never even a void to begin with. It was just your perception of a void that kept you in that state of never feeling enough, no matter how much you get. And then once it isn't there anymore, you start looking beyond yourself, because you're already full and you're already complete. And it's like, all right, how can I help others to recognize this as well? Because you see yourself in them. You have empathy. You don't perceive so much division and a separate life, because that's going to reinforce that suffering, just like that void always did. So yeah, everything shifts as this perspective shifts.
For sure. But this is going to be a different kind of journey, right? Because I was watching an interview with Mr. Beast, and he was saying that early on, when he really first started making good money, bought himself like $1 million house and sports car or two and things like that. Like he was all into it. And then it was after that he realized, this isn't actually changing my life any. And he actually mentions it in an interview that he recognized it wasn't adding to his life any. And that's the journey that we're talking about. But there's so many examples of that, like Jim Carrey, for example. He had to get everything that he ever wanted, and then he realized, there's nothing I want. I don't like this. This isn't what I want. This isn't me, right? And so here we are, already recognizing all that. There's nothing I want to buy. Like, I think it's really important to recognize, like, if anybody were to walk up and give me $1 billion, I wouldn't be spending it on me, or rather I would be, but not Ray, right? because I don't need anything. I'm the happiest person just, with my coat and my track pants and the same collection of t-shirts that I've had for 3 years. I don't give a shit. It doesn't mean anything to me. And that's what changes how this moves forward, right? Is the fact that all of those resources to me are just resources, right? Like think about Mr. Beast paid for 1,000 cataract surgeries. How many times do you think Elon could have done that? And they don't. Well, why don't they? Well, because it doesn't make any sense to them. How does that add to my value? How does that add to my public appearance? How does that add to the accumulated wealth? How does that add in terms of, investment and return and everything that goes with that mentality? It's not until you're fulfilled in yourself that you can really start to share and serve. And that's the point, right? So yeah, anything that happens here on Dualistic Unity in terms of growth and everything else, we're all a part of this. I'm so very excited about that by the fact that anything that happens with this is the result of everyone who's involved. So it will continue to grow because it is an organic type of growth that's happening because individual cells within this body are recognizing that they're not individual, and it's changing how the body works. And so I look forward to moving forward. I wanted to actually just add something very quickly, two things, because we have to wrap up in about 4 minutes here before a brief break, and then we'll continue on Patreon. Do join us tomorrow if you can for our roundtable episode. Tier 2 and Tier 3 supporters on Patreon have access to the registration form. Several people have already signed up. So we would love to see you on that episode tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just wanted to throw that out there. Secondly, Graham Hancock. I have been really enjoying every interview that I have found with Graham Hancock. I ran across one where he was specifically talking about the possibilities that we have lost certain abilities to align with and impact reality over time, largely as a result of our collective mentality. I very much want to have Mr. Hancock on the show. And so I wrote to him, if you would like to see Graham Hancock on the show, I encourage you to write to him. Go to grahamhancock.com. Let him know about Dualistic Unity and how much we would value his input and very much appreciate the conversation about ancient civilizations, where we might have been, where we may be going again. It's all very exciting. So that is definitely one of the guests that is in my sights currently. I know Amanda already reached out to him, and I appreciate that very much. But anybody in our community, if there's anyone that you want us to talk to, Russell Brand, Joe Rogan, so on and so forth, just tell them in their comment section, leave messages for them. Feel free to send them an email, because we do the best that we can. But as Andrew and I were saying, everything that we have kind of goes into more and more of Dualistic Unity. We're not going to pay someone like Jordan Peterson $1,000 or more to come and appear on the show right now. So it really just comes down to public opinion and pressure. So if you want these people to talk to us, let them know that we're here, and we'd very much appreciate it.
Yeah, it's inevitable at this point. I think that we're gonna cross paths at some point with all of those characters, and those will be very, very fun discussions. Because yeah, I mean, all of them. Recently, we got another one today. It's gonna be an awesome time, and it's just been fun as things have expanded, and we've gone from season 1, 2, 3, 4. Every season we sort of expand our reach and include more iterations of us to keep going through things. And with that, people with larger audiences and whatnot has inevitably happened. But it's really going to be, like it always has been, not a focus on people we think would get us views, but just people we want to talk to. Just people we find interesting is all it comes down to. And I know that's something like Joe Rogan's always sort of had that mentality, and he continues that. Like, he doesn't give a fuck who the person is. If he wants to talk to them, he has them on and he just has a conversation with them. And that's the same mentality that we're holding on to. And so, with people like that, a Graham Hancock, I got to get more into some of his stuff. I've seen some clips, especially that one you sent, that TikTok is like, holy shit. That is that would be a cool guy. I'm curious like how much time he spent chewing on it, and like his perspective of himself through all of these recognitions that he's having. That's going to be really cool to figure out in our conversation at some point. Like with all of our recent guests, there's, I love asking the question of what's your perspective on God? Because a lot of them through, even if it's not directly, recognize that they're it. But it's still, that perception of division is so strong that they may not even realize it until they start, talking about it a little bit more.
Yeah, it's exciting. Moving forward is exciting. Everybody who's already joined the community, you've already made this mind-blowing and life-changing. And I really appreciate everything that I continue to see every day, even in terms of the private messages, Discord chat, Patreon supporters sending us messages and whatnot. We really appreciate anything that you're doing, even just listening to this. It really does help. And everything you are really does help because you are the point. So on that note, we're going to end this episode of Dualistic Unity Raw. We'll take a brief break, and then we're going to continue on Patreon, patreon.com/dualistic unity. Today is a tier 1 conversation. So for only $5 a month, you can join today and twice a week. So you get combined 3.5 hours of discussion time with us every week, all the time, because we enjoy doing this. And if you want to upgrade, you can actually chat with us up to 5 times a week, where we have these group discussions. If you haven't seen a group discussion, join us on Wednesday. We do a free public group. You can register at dualisticunity.com. It's an hour long. Seating is limited, but registration is free. And that's it for today.
All right. Bye, everyone. Looking forward